It is, Your Honor.
All right.
Should mention that exchange you heard there happened without jurors being in the courtroom. Joining me now is civil rights attorney DeWitt Lacy. Welcome back to BNC.
Good to be with you, Denise.
What are your reactions that Derek Chauvin invoked his Fifth Amendment? Are you surprised, or did you expect this?
Frankly, Denise, I'm not surprised at all. I think it would have been a huge mistake for him to testify simply because it gives the prosecution the opportunity to really ask him to explain himself to the jury of why he kept his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And I can't see any reasonable answer that he could have given. You know, all the excuses that he may have given, well, I thought he was resisting. There's been plenty of testimony in the trial which suggested that wasn't necessarily true. All the excuses about whether or not George Floyd, he was trained to restrain George Floyd in that manner, fall flat on its face too, because there's been plenty of testimony from not only experts in the prosecution's case, but also even the own chief of police of his department that said that's not consistent with his training. So I think it was not a surprise, and it benefited him not to testify.
And Eric Nelson said something that was important, and maybe this happens often in trials like this, where he said they had a back and forth, both he and Chauvin, about the Fifth Amendment, whether or not it should be invoked. Why do you think there was seemingly such a back and forth about it?
You know, it's hard to say. There were some who were of the belief that, you know, police officers are trained, trained witnesses, right? Part of their academy training is that they learn how to testify. They know not only the things to say, but how to say them to a jury to make it more believable and or acceptable and palatable to a jury that's listening. So part of what folks might be thinking, or what the defense might have been thinking, is that Chauvin might have had the ability to do that with this jury. But, you know, given all the evidence that was, you know, presented in this trial, I think they probably weighed against that decision.
And we heard a total of 14 days of testimony. The defense only presented its case for 2 days, relatively quickly here. What does that say potentially about their case, that they did only have really 2 star witnesses, you can say?
I mean, it's not uncommon, Venice, and here's the reason why. The burden is on the prosecution to prove their case. The defense doesn't have any burden. As a matter of fact, they didn't have to present anything at all. But the burden is on the prosecution to prove that Derek Chauvin was guilty of either second-degree murder or third-degree murder or some other lesser and included criminal offense. And, you know, the defense doesn't have that burden. So it's not surprising that they didn't put on a lot of witnesses. Maybe to some who are not familiar with these trials, maybe it seems suspicious, but certainly not to seasoned litigators and folks in the courtroom who do this on a regular basis. It was not surprising at all.
Do you think prosecutors presented their case effectively?
Venice, I do. I think they did a stellar job at presenting their case about, you know, Derek Chauvin specifically, and what he did to George Floyd and how he killed him. There were several witnesses that were outstanding and that were memorable that the prosecution put on, and the manner in which they were put on. So I think they did their job. They covered all of their bases, even though today there was, you know, some skepticism about whether or not there needed to be extra testimony about this defense that the defense team was trying to pull out of the hat about carbon monoxide poisoning. I don't think that's going to sit well with the jury for a number of reasons, but I think the prosecution did their job well.
Now, I'll ask you that same question about defense attorney Eric Nelson. Do you think he did his job effectively in poking holes in the prosecution's theory and introducing that doubt?
Well, you know, I think he did his job. All right. Look, the defense's job is a little bit different than the prosecution. The prosecution has to prove their case. The defense just has to throw in, if you will, spaghetti against the wall and see if anything sticks. And that's what the defense did. And I think we'll see a little more, and we'll learn a little more on Monday with the culmination of all the evidence that's presented in closing arguments about how well the defense has done. But certainly there are some things that the defense will be able to say that will attempt to poke some holes in the prosecution's theories of the case. So I think the defense did a good job, but there's just so much evidence in this case weighing against the defendant and weighing in favor of conviction. In my mind, I don't see how the defense comes out with an acquittal in this manner.
But we've been here before where we've seen the video of a black man being either severely beaten or killed by police and still walking free. So most people, a lot of people in the black community, not optimistic just yet. Really quickly, what can we expect from closing arguments on Monday?
Most of the time, prosecutors will come in and kind of tally the evidence. Remember all these folks that we had testify. Remember what they said to you. And also then give some, I guess, not necessarily instruction, but try to create some understanding of the jury instructions that are going to go back into the deliberation room with the jury. The defense will try to do the same and not only talk about remembering some of the evidence, but also talk about maybe some of the failures or the shortcomings that the prosecution may have had. So I think that's what you can expect in closing arguments. I think you'll see a lot of passion being pulled from the prosecution, and the defense will really want to make this about, some obscure findings that maybe weren't tied down all the way by the prosecution.
As jurors head into the deliberation room, how do you think that race, if you do think race, will play a role in those deliberations? Because we do know that the jury is diverse. There are a lot of people of color. When I say a lot, relatively. How do you think that will play in at all?
Hey, Venice, that's a lot for me. Now, look, maybe not in New York or in Minnesota, but for me, when there's 4 black folks on the jury, it makes a big difference. I think when there are any people of color in the room, it changes the conversation about race, and race is the backdrop of this case. It just is. You can't get around that. So I think it changes the conversation into whether or not this was necessary, right? Was it necessary for the officers to behave in this manner? What the defendants will want to do is depict George Floyd as this big, hulking, almost brutish, animalistic person who needed to be held down and put down. And when you have persons of color, especially black people in the room, it changes that conversation, because hopefully they will not allow that depiction to go forward in that jury room.
All right, Civil Rights Attorney DeWitt Lacy, thank you again, as always, for your time. A law enacted to force banks to be fair to people of color